Hello from Medyascope again. Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance released the Global State for Democracy 2019 report. It's a billing yearly report, and we can call this report Global Health Check of Democracy. Today we will discuss the output of this report with Annika-Silva Leander, the Head of Democracy Assessment and Political Analysis at International IDEA. Annika-Silva Leander, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, first I would like to start with a very old question. What is a well-functioning democracy?
Well, for International IDEA, the fundamental pillar of healthy democracy is fair and competitive elections, and that they are held on a periodic basis. But that's a necessary condition for democracy, but it's not a sufficient condition. So for International IDEA, we also believe that there are four other important pillars that are important for healthy democracy. The other pillar is fundamental rights, a high level of fundamental rights, which includes both guarantee for civil liberties, such as freedom of association, for example, good access to justice, and also political gender equality. The third pillar that we believe are important for healthy democracy is informal and formal checks on government. So for us, formal checks on government effective parliament that and also a judiciary that is independent. In terms of informal checks on government, we believe that the media plays a key role also in government power. And then the third element that we administration. There, for us, we see that public authority enforcement and countries also have low levels of corruption. Now, the final pillar that we see essential for the democracy is citizen participation. There again, we look at both formal and informal participation. As I mentioned, we look at formal political processes, both at national and subnational level. But we also think that citizen participation in civil society is a key element of healthy democracy. So to sum up, elections is a necessary condition for democracy, but it's not a sufficient condition. You also need healthy civil society, robust political institutions and judicial institutions that can check the government power.
So at that point, can we say that the 21st century's democracy is ill?
Yes, we can say that 21st century democracy is ill to a certain extent, but I think that it's important to nuance that statement. That the illness that we see depends on the context. So I would say that there are two broad contexts that we can identify based on our analysis. One is the difficulties faced by new democracies are fragile in their democratic development because they haven't had enough time to build solid democratic institutions and solid democratic processes. So they still need to build a democratic culture in a way. And so that is, on one hand, that's what we see in a lot of countries in Asia and in Africa. A lot of countries that transitioned to democracy in the last decades are struggling to build these robust democratic institutions in a context where they also have to face significant economic troubles, that they have to build solid levels of development. But on the other hand, we also see that democracy is ill in older democracies, in more established democracies. Those that have had longer history of democratic development, that have solid democratic building in democracy. It's a different type of illness. It's what we call democratic erosion and democratic backsliding. And it starts from a higher level of democratic development.
So, can we say that populism is the illness of democracy?
Well, actually, we would say that rather than being an illness, we would say that populism is a symptom. It's a symptom of several things that are happening. I think that we identify the rise of populism as driven by both political factors, and if we look at the political factors that drive the rise of populism in Europe, but also in the US, and we see it also in regions such as Latin America and Asia, the political factors include a distancing and a questioning of mainstream political parties. Many voters feel that mainstream traditional political parties are not representing them in the way they want to be represented. They also think that democracies are not delivering what they expected that democracy would deliver for them. And this also coupled with rising middle classes in regions such as Latin America and Central Eastern Europe, and civilized that demands democracy. We also see another political factor is that there are new forms of political engagement that are emerging. Social media plays a key role in driving those transformations. Social media create civic engagement that is more fragmented, less based on traditional organizational structures. It's more individualistic. And it requires more direct communication between politicians and voters. But there are also economic factors that drive the rise of populism. One, I already mentioned it before, it's the lack of perceived delivery of democracies. A lot of voters feel disappointed. They think that democracy should have delivered higher levels of economic growth, higher levels of equality, of socioeconomic equality, and many voters feel disappointed that democracy hasn't been able to reduce social inequality and reduce levels of corruption and produce high levels of economic growth. So I think that there are, to sum up, populism is not an illness as such, it's a symptom of something that is not working the way they should in democracies. And it's driven by both political factors and economic factors.
In 1975, only 25% of countries was democratic, but today, when we look, according to your report, 62% of countries are democratic. But what about the quality of the democracy in those countries?
Yes, exactly. So I think that this is one of the main findings of the report, is that democracies continues to increase in numbers. Even in the last 5 years, we've seen a number of countries, new countries, transition to democracies for the first time in their history. So the number of democracies continue to increase. And there again, we are seeing that the quality is decreasing, both in older democracies, in more established democracies. And I think that in older and more established democracies, the main aspect where we see significant declines is in aspects related to civic space. And for us, we measure civic space through 3 dimensions in our framework of democracy. One relates to media integrity, media diversity, freedom of speech. It also relates to guaranteed civil liberties, such as freedom of association and assembly, freedom of expression, and we also see it in the development of civil society, where we see declining levels of civil society. So the quality of democracy is decreasing in older and more established democracies, and we also see that in the new democracies, many new democracies are struggling to build solid democratic institutions. So for them, it's not a decline in democratic quality, it's that they're not able to really increase their quality that many citizens expect that they would.
And what about corruption? With democracy, is it getting better or worse?
Well, the corruption is a mixed picture. I think that if we take the last 43 years, we see that on a global level, if we look at the global average levels of corruption, they have actually not moved at all. If we look at the trend line for corruption between 1975 and today, it's a flat trend line, because the global levels of corruption are exactly the same today as they were 43 years ago. Now, of course, when we look at different countries to reduce their corruption levels, some countries have increased their corruption levels. more mixed picture at the country level. Actually, if you take the last 5 years, you see that there are actually 2 countries that are level then different, for example, from aspects of civic states, where more decline. But what we see is that those countries that manage to reduce their corruption levels, most of them are concentrated in Africa and Asia, and they are going from very high levels of corruption to mid-range levels of corruption. Very few are actually reaching low levels of corruption. So overall, if we take a long-term perspective, we see that global average levels of corruption have not moved, although we see improvements at the country level for some countries in the last 5 years. But we also see that corruption is becoming a very salient issue, and we see that also discontent in a lot of countries is linked to perceived levels of corruption, the difficulty that many countries have in reducing levels of corruption. Latin America is a good example in case. Latin America has high levels of democratic development, and it's one of the regions that has strengthened most its democratic institutions in the last 4 decades. But the fight against corruption has not kept the pace with levels of democratic development. So we think that it's still a very serious challenge for a number of different African states and what the corruption. And in Latin America, a large share of countries still have high levels of corruption. So it's still a very serious problem, and we also see that this has implications for trust.
So when we look to the voters, we can say that genders are equal, women and men. But when we look to the parliaments, the gender parity is still low. What do you think about that?
Well, for us, we consider political gender equality is one of the areas where we see the slowest growth, together with the fight against corruption. So if you take a long-term perspective, again, you see that there have been some advances in reducing levels of political gender inequality, but the progress is too slow. So in 1975, 5% of parliamentarians were women. Today, only a quarter of the world's parliamentarians are women. So we've seen that it's improved over the last decade, but we have still not reached the parity when we look at the average. Only 25% of parliamentarians are women today, and that's too low. And we have calculated that current progress on political gender equality and women's representation in the decade can take almost another 50 years to reach gender parity over. It's significantly enhanced.
And when we come to Turkey, how do you see Turkey's democracy?
So I'm not a Turkey specialist, and I want to start by saying that. So I'm sure that viewers are much more in tune with the situation in Turkey. But what I can tell you is what we see in our data and in our index on democracy in Turkey. So we identify that there are 97 democracies in the world, and Turkey is still classified as a democracy. In our index goes until 2018, so it doesn't cover 2019. But up until 2018, Turkey was still classified as a democracy. But this is with a very minimalistic definition of democracy, built on the criteria that minimally competitive elections are held. And Turkey fits that criteria until 2019. So we see that Turkey in our index is a very fragile and very weak democracy. It's actually one of the weakest democracies in the world. So if you take the 5 aspects of democracy that I mentioned at the beginning, we see that Turkey has low performance, very low performance on all the indicators, on representative government, on fundamental rights, on checks on government, on impartial administration, and on participatory engagement. We also see that Turkey is one of the democracies in the world that has suffered most declines in the past 5 years. And it has suffered declines in civic space and in government. So we also see that there are 10 countries in the world that are suffering from what we call democratic backsliding, with what we define as an intentional weakening of checks and balances and checks and balances and defines and civil liberties. Turkey is 10 backsliding. So what we see is growing developments in Turkey. That it's a mixed picture because at the same time, the political space is not completely chosen. I think that the elections in Istanbul earlier in the spring this year provided sort of an unexpected development where the elections were supposed to be reheld and the opposition actually won the majority of seats. So that was a positive development in terms of the democratic health of Turkey, but we still see that there are worrying signs of democratic weakness in Turkey that need to be addressed.
Annika-Silva Leander, the Head of Democracy Assessment Political Analysis at International IDEA, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks. And thank you all for watching us.